what we do. We're India Fact Quiz, and we run the game of facts every Saturday at 5 p.m. in Hindi and in English. Today, it's just going to be English. And this is a quiz which has got nothing to do with general knowledge or bookish knowledge. It's got more to do with testing your biases and just knowing more about what's out there in our immediate world, right? So we keep saying that it's all very well to know who the richest man in the world is, but if you don't know what the literacy rates in your own country are, then it's a bit of a problem. So with that, so glad to introduce Nikhil Menon. He's the author of this wonderful book called Planning Democracy. Nikhil, I got my copy, by the way, and it's a wonderful read of modern history. Nikhil's a historian and an assistant professor in history in the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, where he joins us from this morning. So thank you, Nikhil, for starting your day with In Fact Quiz. And very quickly, before we get into the quiz, I had a ton of questions to ask. And by the way, there was so much to learn from this book. I've bookmarked it right through. But I wanted to know, what is this book? And if you can just, I've read it, but for the rest of us, I'm just fascinated to know. So finally, there's so much in this and you've covered so many aspects, but what is this book about? And then if you can just tell us a bit about why you decided to write this. What appealed to you to just unpack this particular aspect of our history?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. As you said, I'm starting my day with this, and I'm very glad to be doing so. So this book, Planning Democracy, How a Professor, an Institute, and an Idea Shaped India, is about one of India's great experiments, really. How India, right after independence, combines both parliamentary Western-style democracy and socialist-inspired and Soviet Union-inspired five-year planning, especially at a time during the Cold War when these two ideas were considered fundamentally incompatible. That how could you have a democracy that also had a socialist economy? These were seen as warring ideologies. So how does India come to adopt these? And so the book really tries to sketch out the story of how planning became so central to the idea and the story of modern India. And it uses planning as a lens by which to understand the Indian state after independence. And it looks at how planning came to dominate the elites, Indian elites thinking about the economy and about society in politics and in civic life. In some ways, the five-year plans, the first, second, third onwards, the five-year plans really marked an alternate national calendar for the country. And so the book is not really about whether the five-year plan succeeded or failed. You know, many economists have written on this. It's about rather how India captures the imagination, how planning captures the imagination of Indians and how it comes to shape things like India's data infrastructure and the narrative that it conveys to India's citizens.
So this is,
yes.
Sorry, no, go on, Nikhil.
No, you'd also asked me about how I came to writing this book. And so this book is based on my on research that I did for my PhD at Princeton University. And the reason that I picked this topic is that I had grown up with hearing about the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission, of course, was consigned to the dustbin of history in 2014. But growing up in the 1990s in India, the Planning Commission is something that you read about in the newspapers, saw on TV shows, but it seemed to be this very dry story about these elites doing, pulling the levers of economic policy and government. But then I realized that in the early 1950s, it wasn't something that was so remote from citizens. It was something that really was seen as central to the idea of what this new independent nation would be after 2 centuries of colonialism. And so I wondered, how is it that something that seemed so dry as planning at one point captured the imagination of sadhus, of people in Bollywood, of India's cultural elite, of India's political elite as well. And so that's the story I'm trying to tell.
So Daniel is asking if you could tell him your qualification. So very quickly, a quick introduction, please.
Yes, so my qualifications for writing this book, I suppose, are that I have a PhD in history. I studied history in India before that at their university and at JNU. And then I did a PhD in history at Princeton University. And so I spent sort of 6 years on my PhD completing doing coursework and then research for this book. And this book is based on archival research in 3 countries, in India, of course, in many archives across India, in the United Kingdom, and in the United States.
So I know why Daniel's asking that, because you definitely don't fit the stereotype of a historian. You look far too young for that. So I think we were just having, is something wrong with our eyesight, or is something wrong with, us? Is the wrong person appearing on the screen? I think that was a confusion. So
I think it's Zoom has some very good filters now. No, I'm kidding.
No. So yes, Nikhil Menon is extremely legit, and it's wonderful to see such young historians. Now, and in a sense, Nikhil, you are a fact checker, right? Because all historians are fact checkers.
Yes, I think that in some ways we are fact checkers and also fact pickers, in that one thing that you learn as historians is that, part of the training is not just about uncovering history, but it's that there is so much history. It's deciding what parts of history that you want to emphasize or to highlight, right? I mean, I cannot recount every second of every life of everyone that lived in the 1950s in India. And so I have to pick a particular story and pull on that particular thread. And I have to be very conscientious and truthful about the evidence that turns up in the archives, right? So if there's something that goes against my preconceived notions, I need to still be able to be honest and put that down on the page. And so I have done that many times during the course of doing my research. And so, yes, you are checking facts that others have uncovered, but you're also in some ways introducing new facts into the public domain and providing citations so that others can fact check you as well, right? That one of the responsibilities of any academic or any scholar is that you provide falsifiable evidence that others can check it and say, yes, Nikhil Menon was being a truthful researcher, or no, he made up these so-called facts.
Wonderful. And Nikhil, just wanted to ask you, why is data critical to democracy? You've pretty much established that, but I just, going into this book, and you are looking at statistics, and you're looking at something which is sort of, today we can sit back and say, oh my gosh, we never even knew we had these kind of institutions, and we had this kind of temperament to data, statistics, planning. One doesn't quite see that in modern life today. Things are so random that, if I probably would think, is this really fiction? Did this really happen? It reads that fantastical. So why do you feel that data is so important to democracy?
That's a very good question. I think that any modern state or civil society needs reliable information about its citizens and their lives. This is important to ensure not just basic things, like to know basic things that we all should know as citizens of the country, or at least the governance of the country, the governors of the country should know things like how many poor people are there in the country, right? Or how many people died from the COVID pandemic. Both of these questions, by the way, are extremely controversial. Health statistics are extremely controversial in India, and so are statistics about how many poor people are there in the country, because, of course, it reflects on government's performances, and opposition parties can use that in politics. But it's important not just for the politics, it's important for us to know, in order to be able to provide services, to make services available for the poor, or to know whether something needs to be changed in the economy or not. And in order for government to be effective, and for us as democratic citizens, for us to be able to make informed political choices, we need to know whether unemployment, for example, in the past 2 years has gone up or down, or whether in a certain government's term, things such as violent crime went up or down, right? These are things that affect us on an everyday basis. You want to know whether the people you voted into power have dealt with things like crime that might affect you when you're walking on the street. So reliable data really is the lifeblood of any modern democratic governance. And in Planning Democracy, I've tried to tell the story of how India established a data infrastructure as early as the 1950s that was the envy of the developing world, and in some ways actually was marveled at by even the developed world. Many people in the developed world thought that India's large-scale sample survey infrastructure was just not likely to succeed, or not likely to produce rigorous results. But as we've seen, it did. And for decades, it was seen as a pioneer. India was seen as a pioneer in setting up these large data infrastructures, such that, in fact, some of the World Bank's own sample surveys today are, in some ways, look back to this period and are inspired by this period.
Okay, so before we both squeal any more spoilers, I think we should get into the quiz. Aditya has asked two very interesting questions. Maybe we'll take that as we get into the quiz. I hope that's okay, Aditya. We're going to make sure Nikhil answers your question. But we're really excited. And I know everybody just waits to start. But this is a little different, Nikhil. Normally, when we have authors who come, on the Game of Facts, our quizzers are absolutely shameless. They're like, no, get on with the quiz, get on with the quiz. We can talk later. But this bunch, I think, is a little interested to hear what you have to say, which is fantastic. But we'll get on with the quiz. So I'm going to share my screen now. And as usual, we'll have 3 poll questions. And in between this, I'm going to ask you the questions that the participants are asking us. And I'm going to definitely ask Aditya's question that's coming up. So right now I'm going to share my screen. And I hope all of you have got the game pin. That's what you're here for, right? So as all of you join in, maybe if you need a few more minutes. Nikhil, very quickly, Aditya is asking, how effective has the Mahalanobis method in context of the first planning commission been? That was one question. And his second question is, since you mentioned about being a fact picker, would you comment about—
I think that's by Abhishek, not Aditya, the second.
Oh, sorry, that's Abhishek. I'm sorry. So maybe you could answer Aditya's question first.
Yes, thanks, Aditya, for that question. The question of how effective Mahalanobis was in some ways depends on whether you're asking about how effective he was as a statistician, which was his primary job, or as an economic planner. I'd say that as a statistician, he was a sort of outstanding success. He is seen as one of the great statisticians in the world of the 20th century. He was inducted into as a fellow of the Royal Society in Britain, only I think the 11th Indian to be inducted into that fellowship. So he was a real pioneer globally in the field of statistics and sample surveys. As an economic planner, his legacy is much more mixed, and it depends on the economist you ask. So I think that all of them would agree that he was enormously influential. In some ways, he charted the path for India's economy from the mid-1950s right up to the market reforms of 1991. So he was enormously influential. The question of whether India's economy performed as well as it could is a more complicated question, and one that I get into. And there are differing views on. Many people agree that the Indian economy could have grown faster. But the question really is, what needed to have changed? Was planning itself the problem, or was India's choice of choosing an import substitution model rather than an export-led model the problem? So I won't say more, but there's a lot more to get into there.
All right. And now to Abhishek's question. I'm sorry, Abhishek, that was your question. Since you mentioned about being a fact picker, would you—
I'm sorry, I lost the audio.
Sorry, I think I got lost for a minute. I'm back.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so Abhishek's question. Also, how much did they compose personal accounts, and how many focused on statistics? Okay, I think maybe we'll just unpack one part of it. Abhishek, we'll probably have to guess what the second part of the question is, but the resources that you referred to for your research, and how difficult, Nikhil, was that to even access?
Yes, and I think that also relates to Denil Parmar's question about whether I visited historical places. So the resources that are in some ways the bread and butter of a historian are archives. And so a lot of the research that I did was in Mumbai, in Delhi, and in Kolkata, at the archives where they store the personal papers and the official correspondence of these people. So in Delhi, at the Teen Murti Library and Archives, at the National Archives of India, in Mumbai, at the Films Division Archives in Kolkata, at the Institute School Institute itself in Baranagar, where they have the P.C. Mahalanobis papers. In London at the British Library, in the United States, the Rockefeller Archive Center. So these are places where they store these papers, and so you have to go in and look for the papers, and often it is a huge, vast amount of papers, and you need to spend months. In fact, I suppose I've spent more than years looking at the papers of these different people. And so, yes, I don't visit historical places in terms of places of historical interest. I mean, I wish, I mean, that would be more like a holiday. It's more sort of dry and boring, and sort of a lot more sort of a bigger task in terms of going through all of these papers. So I combined that with looking at things like popular culture and looking at plays and novels from the 1950s, looking at movies from the 1950s, and looking to see if there's any story of planning that I could uncover from those.
I think Daniel's still having issues coming to terms with, are you really a real historian or... But no, jokes apart. So welcome Rohit, Jitendra, Swati, Dipti, Neharika, Vanshika. Nikhil, most of these are our winners, by the way. Every week they walk away with books. Dipankar is a dear friend of Game of Facts, and he's based in Bangalore. Akhil, Rohit, Bharat, Ritika, Adit, Parisha, Arya, Sri Harshita. I mean, they're all incredible players. Kishore, Vinod, Abhishek, Adya. Adya is like one of those winners who like keep, you know, insisting on where's my book? I haven't got it. Kartikeya, hi, good timing. So yeah, it's I think we're ready.
Thank you all for joining.
And as usual, we have poll questions, and normally these are questions which really, there are no right answers for. You can pick and choose what you want. It's just so that you get a little into the game. And then we start off with 13 questions this week. So the poll questions, well, it's a very special edition of the Game of Facts. Thank you, Nikhil, again. And the first poll question we have is simple. Do you vote? I do, but just for the sake of it, I'm least bothered. Yes, I make an informed choice. No, I'm not 18 yet, so this question probably doesn't count for me. What's your choice? Okay, so clearly we have a very informed group here. I told you, Nikhil, these are very special people. They are absolute, and I genuinely mean it, they are outliers. I mean, people who are genuinely interested in issues that matter and go beyond sort of the frivolous stuff. There are very few who can even understand it. They're actually a very small group in this country, and you have them definitely here in this room. So that's
very impressive.
So the next question. On what basis do you assess a political candidate? Is it through the media, TV, newspapers? You do your research, all the channels possible before you make your choice. You look at nomination papers, declaration, how many times they've gone to parliament, etc., or family background, caste, social background, etc., is important for you. Okay, so clearly there is the element of looking at the data per se, you know, the primary data as we call it, which is really your nomination papers that candidates put out there. And actually organizations like ADR, PRS have made all of these things so much easier to access. And then there's also the research of all the channels possible, the avenues, I guess, possible. And then definitely television and newspapers still continues to be an interesting or an important source of information on candidates. And yes, of course, I think family background, you know, those things do matter as well. I guess that's not as high, but still in the reckoning. All right, so we'll go into our wordplay. This is one part we all love at IFQ. When we do the word, insights, and we're asking word of phrase, democracy. Put in your word or phrase feel comes closest to what you think democracy is. Think something going wrong, but either not is I hope this is better. Nikhil, I hope you can. There seems to be an issue with my internet connection, but it'll work itself out. I'm just going to take it to figure it's wrong. So I'll just stop sharing for just a minute. I'm so glad we haven't started the quiz yet. So just give me a second and I'll just figure out.
Perhaps in the meantime, I could respond to Dipankar's question.
Please, yes.
Yes, so Dipankar, thank you for your question. You asked, history is now being given versions based on the beliefs of people. How do we save the real history for the future? I think that, yes, this is an issue. The politicization of history is not a new phenomenon, but I think that in some ways it is becoming ever more concentrated and is becoming a more serious issue day by day. I think that history is always going to be contested, and it isn't as if all historians agree on everything. This is something that I think is worth understanding, which is that just as in science, in any profession, historians have to clear a certain bar. We have to publish history in peer-reviewed journals and in books. So, for example, this book is published by Penguin in India, but in the United States and the United Kingdom, it's published by University Press. And the process for which is that it is read by scholars who are esteemed in the field, who I still do not know, and they provide feedback. And if they think it's not worthy of being published, that it's got certain things wrong, it will not be published. And so I think that, and there will be reviews of the book by other experts who disagree based on their expertise. And so some part of it is likely to be contested. But I think that the problem is when people who are not experts at all start talking about history and start wanting to spin out historical narratives that are not backed by the facts or not backed by any expertise. And so I think that one way to preserve history and some level of rigor in our understanding of history is to respect experts who spend time, who spend years in doing research, spend years in trying to accumulate some expertise on the subject. Just like in any other field, you would respect somebody who is who's an expert in chemistry if they have a PhD in chemistry, somebody who's worked on this subject and published and is respected by their peers. I think that similarly we need to think of it with history as well, which is that yes, people who don't have PhDs can write history as well, but that history has to stack up to and measure up to the levels of rigor required by historians of themselves. And so I think one way is to think about why certain political narratives are spun out, what the motivations might be, and compare those to what historians or experts in that field have written about the field. So I think that that is one way to think about it. One is to look at, has this person done research on this subject? And secondly, could there be political motivations behind the subject? So for example, if you see a politician making a historical claim, you might want to ask yourself, whatever the politician's background is, do they have any expertise on this? Have they written on this subject? Have they researched this subject at all? Or is it just something that conveniently fits with their political ambitions?
Great. Okay, so I think we can resume, and I'm fingers crossed. I hope nothing goes wrong now. We're going to try getting back to the word cloud. Oh, sorry. We're going to start with the quiz, actually. So we've missed the word cloud. We'll probably come back to that at some point. We'll put it up on maybe our Instagram story or something and try and get your comments. But we're going to start the quiz now. It's 13 questions as usual. Don't bother Googling or anything of that sort. Anyway, it's just 20 seconds that you get. Just test your bias a bit and go for the option that makes you probably think a little harder or makes you feel a little uncomfortable. That's the only hint I'm going to give you. So we start with the first question, and double points for this one. During independence, sections of society who were supporters of economic planning and five-year plans were largely members of the Communist Party of India, business leaders, Congress Party, or all of the above. We're asking who the supporters of economic planning and the five-year plans were. Okay, I'm really not having a very lucky day here. So, yeah, I'm just going to take a pause, and I think we're going to have Meenal share the quiz. Meenal is going to have to generate the game pin all over again. So please just hang in with us. We're going to have to do this all over. So just help me out here. Meenal, if you can just take it over, please.
Yes, just give me 1 second.
Yes, Krish. Actually, the fault is mine. I'm having terrible internet issues where I am. So I keep getting knocked off the quiz. So I'm asking Meenal to step in and help. And she's generated a new pin. So you'll just have to make sure that you put that game pin in. And I'm really sorry about this. It's been happening fairly often. Meenal, I don't think folks can see the pin because there's a band that's covering it. So yeah, it's 3550891. The game pin's 3550891. Please put that in. Okay, I think if Nikhil's around,
Yes.
actually good to start. Sorry about that, Nikhil. It's
All right.
normally bad, but not this bad.
That's okay.
We can quickly probably skip the first two questions and then go to the word cloud if we want. We were asking what the the word or phrase or what democracy means to you. I think that's really, yeah, according to you, a word or phrase that describes democracy. If you can please put that in, because you'll just make such beautiful word clouds for us that we don't want to let this opportunity go by. Right. So it's one vote, one value. Democracy is insane. Actually, that's true. But I think in all of this, insanity is just, we can't have it any other way. So when democracy goes wrong, you just need to add more democracy, right? It means freedom, informed choice, accountability. I think, yes, that's a wonderful word. Constitution, democracy ought to be a happy place, peaceful. Yes, the path is unstable, and it's an everyday effort. And I think citizen engagement and citizens being involved is the only way that can make democracy work. So yes, propaganda shouldn't be. I think we as citizens need to be smart enough to see through propaganda. And, that's one of the things probably we'll discuss as we go through this quiz. Power, well, I hope it's power of the citizens. We have to flip that equation. All right, so with that, we'll get into the quiz. I'm going to ask the first question again because most of you didn't get a chance to even answer it. So here we have the first question of this quiz. And double points for this one. During independence, sections of society who were members of economic planning and five-year plans were largely members of the Communist Party of India, or were they business leaders, members of the Congress Party, because that was the party in power at that time, or all of the above? Okay, so 26 of you said all of the above, and that is true. And Nikhil, when you were researching the book, this was clearly one thing which was, there were people across the board found economic planning or having these five-year plans of value. I would argue that in this book, you mentioned that a lot of business leaders really wanted this because they wanted stability for their businesses. So what was your, takeaway or something interesting that you came across, and the role of business leaders in wanting more stability or action-oriented five-year plans?
Yes, I think that often people, perhaps people less informed than those on this quiz, assume that planning was something that was associated only with socialists or communists or the Congress Party. But what we have to remember is that in the period after the Second World War, economic planning was something that was really popular across the world, not just in India. Kinds of things that seemed like economic planning was seen to be done in even the United States under the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. In the United Kingdom, after the Second World War, the Labour Party had economic planning as part of its election manifesto. In many countries in the decolonizing African continent, countries were engaged in economic planning: France, Japan, South Korea, India, of course. So this was part of a global movement. And the reason that in India it's popular across this political spectrum, from people like Tagore to Tata, is that in India, it was again seen as part of India's anti-colonial heritage. Capitalism was seen as associated with colonialism and our colonial masters, and so we could not adopt capitalism. The language of capitalism was sort of corrupted with its association with the colonial rule of the British. And so India was looking for options that were deemed socialist, and economic planning seemed the appropriate option. And the reason that India's business leaders were interested in planning is that they thought that this would provide that India's business was so small, the sort of amount of investment that India's business leaders could put in was so small compared to what India needed, that was seen that as necessary for the government to step in, that only the government could really kickstart some true industrialization of India. And apart from that, as some scholars have argued, Indian industrialists also had a self-serving reason to want economic planning, which is that they wanted to close India's borders to imports from other countries to protect their own market, right? They did not want to compete with Japanese industry, with Korean industry, with American-made sort of products, for example. And so Indian industrialists were also happy for this import substitution industrialization model, because India, of course, has a huge home market, and the Tatas and the Birlas and all these companies had the first movers advantage in, if they protected it from anyone else from entering from outside, they, of course, could service this market and profit greatly.
Okay, this is very fascinating. So we'll get into the scoreboard very quickly, and it's Sri Harshita, Vanshika, Parisha, Adit, and Mukesh in the lead. I think Sharvani has a question. We'll probably come to that later. And we'll get into the next question now. Again, double points for this one. The political party which patronized the Bharat Sadhu Samaj, or the Indian Society for Ascetics, was it the Congress Party, the Communist Party of India, the Jan Sangh, or the BJP? This was a very fascinating chapter in your book. And well, okay, so it was most of us thought it was between the Jan Sangh and the BJP. And then, well, actually, surprisingly, the right answer is the Congress Party, and they got the least number of people picking that particular option. But it was the Congress Party. And I must say, Nikhil, this was one fact that even I was absolutely gobsmacked and surprised to even know that this was their creation. A bit of a problematic group here. Could you tell us something about this and some fascinating aspects about this as you researched for the book?
Yes, I too was, Rashmi, was really surprised when I came across this in the archives. I came across this document that referred to a meeting at Birla Mandir in February 1956 between members of parliament represented from the Congress Party, including the then Minister of Planning and Labour, Gulzarlal Nanda, who became a two-time Prime Minister, of course, for 7 days each. And these sadhus. And the idea was for the sadhus and for members of the Congress Party to join to form this organization to help promote the 5-year plan. And that was what the Bharat Sadhu Samaj was. And so it had backing from the Congress Party to the extent that it was being mocked by opposition parties, including the Jan Sangh, that referred to these sadhus as Congress sadhus. And of course, the long arc of the story, if you read the book, it leads to sort of interesting outcomes for the Congress Party. I think that in some ways it blows back up in the Congress Party's face, but you'll have to read the book to see where that story takes you.
That was for me the highlight of this book, by the way. All right, so we'll very quickly go to the next question. And before that, we have to see the scoreboard. And I think Isha was in the lead. But the next question coming up, the father of Indian statistics and architect of the second 5-year plan, P.C. Mahalanobis, was trained in physics, engineering, economics, or statistics. Right. Okay. So seems fairly obvious, right? Father of Indian statistics. And then you have that option, and it's actually physics. But yes, a very fascinating individual. Nikhil, there was, when you sort of put this character together and really bring him to life, and you think father of Indian statistics, must be extremely, one-dimensional. A very interesting character that you bring up. His training in physics, I'd request you, please don't divulge more than, you ought to beyond. Were you surprised about, the fact that here's somebody who's trained in physics, who's now looking at building India's statistics backbone?
I lay out quite early in the book this episode in which Mohandas, who is then a student at King's College in Cambridge, a student of physics, and has already got a scholarship to do his postgraduate degree at a lab of someone who would go on to become a Nobel Prize winner in physics. So this is someone who had a very promising career ahead of him as a physicist. And indeed, when he comes back to India, he does spend a lot of his career as teaching physics at Presidency College, now university in Kolkata. But it's on his journey back to India during the First World War that he picks up this magazine called Biometrica, which is a new journal of statistics, that he is sort of infected by this bug and is fascinated by the role that statistics could play in the development of the country. And so while he's trained as a physicist, he believes that statistics is important because it can play a public role in the nation. And that is what leads him to eventually becoming a planner, an economic planner as well.
Fascinating, truly. So in a sense, that also tells us that if you're doing something today, you could very much pivot and get on to something else. Well, the best of the best have done it. So we'll very quickly look at the scoreboard. And Sharvani, you were asking, you've joined in late. Is it too late? No, it's never late. You should know that better than anybody else. You've actually won a lot of quizzes, sometimes by really trailing and then catching up towards the end. So quickly log in and get on this quiz. It's super, super interesting. So the Chabras are clearly on to something here, and they're in the top lead, which is Mukesh and Nishant, Isha, Parisha, and Adit. Let's see if anything gets upset here. So on to the next question now. And double points for this one as well. India's first 2 digital computers were housed in IIT Bombay, Indian Statistical Institute, Calcutta, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, which is incidentally in Bombay, or IIT Kharagpur. Right. Okay. I think there's been, Nikhil, too much of rocket boy all around. And I think somewhere probably, a lot of us thought, lots of things happened there in that era. So it must be the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. But surprise, surprise, it was actually Calcutta that housed the first 2 digital computers. Nikhil, some more interesting things. I mean, I really felt very, very sorry for the city of Calcutta, because when you look at the 50s and the 60s through your lens in your book, it really looks like the epicenter of all fantastic things when it comes to, statistics, knowledge, intellect, etc. It seems like those really were the heydays. A few things.
Yes, I think that firstly about the perception that the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research was where the first computers were, and because of this new show, I think that the perception is because of the fact that it is true that TIFR and Homi Bhabha developed India's first, some of India's first digital computers, but it did not develop India's first digital computer, which was actually developed at ISI Calcutta. And the first 2 major computers that came and were used in India actually weren't developed in India at all. They were brought from the USSR, the Soviet Union, and from the United Kingdom. And both of those were brought by Mahalanobis to ISI Calcutta. And so in some ways, and in fact, even the Atomic Energy Commission's calculations from TIFR were sent to Calcutta for them to be performed on the computers in Calcutta and then sent back to the Atomic Energy Commission. It's only in the late 1950s that Homi Bhabha is able to convince the Nehru government to provide a computer to Bombay as well.
Great. All right. So a quick look at the scoreboard. And it's now Parisha, Adit, Kartikeya, Mukesh, and Nishant in the top 5. We'll go to the next question. The game is not over till it's over. So the United States of America, the oldest democracy in the world, was also the first to develop the poverty line. Is this statement true or false? Okay, a bit of a hung parliament there, I think, but false is the correct answer. In fact, it was India that was, I won't say the first. I don't think Nikhil makes that claim in his book either, but clearly India was the one before the United States to develop the poverty line. And I think, you know, when we think about space programs or really massive, big, huge infrastructure projects, and they're so visible, right? And they look so, oh my gosh, this is a sign of, you know, development. But actually things like poverty line or policies that actually were able to raise people from a very large demographic from absolute abject poverty to lower middle class. I think these are sort of the most powerful and effective, whether you want to call them, you know, showstoppers of civilization, I would argue, as opposed to probably other more visible, fancy things. Right, we'll take a look at the scoreboard, and then we still have lots of questions to ask Nikhil as well. But very quickly, there's been another tumble. It's now Adit, Kartikeya, Isha, Madan, and Parisha. And Swati is the highest climber. So everyone just hang in there. This is going to be a very, very special book, which eventually will be signed by the author. But yeah, this is going to be a special game of facts to really fight for. So we'll get into the next question. Double points for this question. The World Bank's flagship household survey, the Living Standards Measurement Study, can trace its lineage back to India's first 5-year plan, India's National Sample Survey, the UN Statistical Commission Survey, or the UN World Development Report. Okay, so 10 of you got it right. Nikhil, if you can come in here and just tell us a bit about when you started to stumble on this information of actually seeing the blueprint of some of these gold standard surveys, which are put out by organizations like World Bank, etc., actually being derived to a great extent from Indian surveys. What was that feeling?
Yeah, I think that I realized the true extent and the true influence of India's national sample surveys only when I started reading up on, for example, on you know, posts written by about Mahalanobis when he died in 1972. When they wrote about all his achievements, they started talking about, you know, how what he set up in India through the Indian Statistical Institute and the National Sample Survey has had this long afterlife. And in fact, this was brought to my attention through a report that I read on the website of the UN Statistical Commission, this connection to the current World Bank's household survey. And it's something that's attested to also by, in an op-ed by the Nobel Prize winner Abhijit Banerjee, who also talks about this as a proud legacy of India and talks about how India's sort of data infrastructure in some ways is crumbling or being made to crumble, and that we need to shore up its foundations, and that this connection between the National Sample Survey and the World Bank's household survey is one of the few examples we have of a homegrown institution really having such an international impact, right? It is now the gold standard used across the world. We have very few such things that we can boast about that is used across the world as the standard.
Fantastic. All right, so we'll take a look at the scoreboard and just celebrate all those who are there, because you know that this is a very dynamic scoreboard and it keeps changing. So Adit, Kishore, Kartikeya, Nishant, and Rohit, just hang in there for a little longer. We'll get into the next question. You can't build a future on Coca-Cola. Now, this quote can be attributed to this Prime Minister in his or her address in the Parliament. Is it Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, Indira Gandhi, or Jawaharlal Nehru? Okay, so I think our bias would lead us to think international US company, probably BJP leader. I think there's a bit of maybe a bit of a contradiction there. Nikhil, can you just step in here and just give us a little bit of context to this? Because I also thought this was very fascinating in terms of how our political leaders were thinking about, where or how India really should focus on its economic growth.
Yeah, so the correct answer, of course, is Nehru. And he says this in Parliament at a time in which he's trying to explain the government's economic policy. And the government's economic policy which was part of this Mahalanobis strategy, was to focus on what was called capital goods industries, as opposed to consumer good industries. So Coca-Cola, headphones, laptops, all of these are consumer goods. Things like factories that produce iron and steel, or factories that produce chemical fertilizers, these are capital goods. And the belief in the 1950s and 60s, which was again a very mainstream belief amongst development economists across the world, was that poor countries needed to invest first in capital goods industries and not spend money on consumer goods industries, because consumer goods really don't do anything for the larger industrial potential of the country, whereas these capital goods could, over 20 years, make a huge difference in the industrial capacity of the country. And that is something that economists have pointed to as one of the successes of post-colonial India in the 1950s and 60s. We were able to build up quite a good amount of industrial capacity because of this sort of single-minded attention to building capital goods industries. And so what the Prime Minister was telling India's citizens was that Indians as consumers will have to sort of wait. We'll have to wait for a time when we can go to the supermarket and have shelves full of all kinds of consumer goods that fill our consumer desires. But instead, we'll have to, allow for the country to invest first in these things that will have a greater long-term potential.
Sounds very austere, but I think it was very sensible. So very quickly to the scoreboard. It's now Adit, Kishore, Madan, Jitendra, and Parisha. And we'll get into the next question. Again, double points for this one. The first female member of the Planning Commission appointed by PM Nehru was the niece of the Prime Minister, a criminal lawyer, a poet and novelist, or an economist and statistician. Okay, so 5 of you got a criminal lawyer correct. And she comes across as a very fascinating individual. And Nikhil, you had a little story to tell about this person. Would you like to talk a little bit?
Yes, yeah, sure. This person is Durgabai Deshmukh, who was someone who is from, of course, was then from Bombay Presidency, from Maharashtra today. She was a social worker, had participated in the freedom movement, was a Gandhian herself, and was married to at that time a widower, C.D. Deshmukh, who was the finance minister of the country and was seen as one of the most, once his wife had died, one of the most sort of eligible bachelors in Delhi. And this was a sort of the talk of gossip in Delhi about how is it that somebody who was as flamboyant and charismatic as C.D. Deshmukh, who's the kind of person who was at the Bretton Woods conference in 1944, was India's ex-RBI governor, was a very stylish man. How was he with this woman who was very austere, very Gandhian, very quote unquote simple? And when Durgabai Deshmukh was tapped by Prime Minister Nehru to join the Planning Commission, she in fact at first refused. She writes in her autobiography, Chintaman and Me, referring to Chintaman Deshmukh, her husband. She said no because she thought that it would look inappropriate because her husband was already on the Planning Commission and that it might look like nepotism. To which the Prime Minister said that, it is my decision whether to appoint you or not. You can decide whether to agree or not. And I do not think it's nepotistic because I'm not appointing you because you're married to Chintaman Deshmukh. I'm appointing you for your own credentials, and your own credentials are that as a social worker. And we need somebody with that perspective on the Planning Commission. Because, of course, we have to remember that the Planning Commission was set up in 1950. India is still dealing with a huge problem of the rehabilitation of partition refugees, and social work was a very important part of what India needed to grapple with.
Okay, so very quickly, the scoreboard, and then we'll continue with the questions. They just get more and more fascinating. So it's now Adit in the lead, followed by Nishant, Kishore, Madan, and Jitendra. And we'll get into the next question. This report argued that the state should legally recognize women's labor inside the home. Is it the 12th five-year plan, which was in 2012-2017, the National Planning Committee report from 1938, the 5th five-year plan in 1974 to 78, or the 10th five-year plan, which was in 2002 to 2007? Just make note of the years and answer the question accordingly. And 7 of you actually got this right. It was pre-independence where, this committee of some remarkable women were actually thinking about issues that we are still grappling with today, which is about how do we think about unpaid work? How do we think about compensating women for the labor that they do inside the home as well as within, the family business? So these were sort of very important issues that they were grappling pre-independence. And for me personally, this was such a wonderful sign that really there was so much richness in thought to think about issues like this. And somewhere, I guess it got lost, but 70 years, 75 years, I mean, that's the beauty of history, right? It keeps coming up every now and then. And I think we can really take some learnings from a 1938 report, which looks and recognizes women's work, unpaid work in the household. All right, so we'll take a look at the scoreboard and let's see how each one's doing. It's now Adit, Nishant, Kartikeya, Kishore, and Rohit, and we'll get into the next question. Right, so double points for this one as well. In the 1950s, computers, or UNIVAC as they were called at that time, had a price tag of $5,000 US, 10,000 US dollars, $1 million US, or 50,000 US dollars. What would you think? Okay, so the computers part, Nikhil, was just a very fascinating part of technology history. I think you somewhere, sort of went to biography, then you've gotten to, all about economic planning and data and statistics, and now you're into, talking about technology. I think this was a very fascinating chapter. Nikhil, do you want to just talk a little bit? When you saw this number, did you think that you had seen a wrong number? There were too many zeros in this one?
I mean, luckily for me, it was clarified by the fact that it was written out in letters. Million is an M-I-L-L-I-O-N. And so that clarified it for me, because when I saw the numbers as the digits alone, they did seem eye-popping. The idea that one computer, and we have to remember that the amount of, number crunching power that device had is less than what my phone right now has, right? Everybody has in our pockets more than what $1 million of number crunching potential could do in the 1950s. And so these were huge devices that occupied an entire room and needed air conditioning in order for it to be cooled in the climate of Calcutta. But yes, it cost $1 million. And so, which is why the first two computers that came to India did not buy. It came through multilateral aid programs that India had to petition the United Nations for and the United Kingdom for, in order to justify this. And one of the ways in which India justified it is by saying that we need these computers. We're not going to use them for military reasons. We're going to use them, unlike the Americans, unlike the Soviets, who using them to calculate ballistic ranges, etc., for military calculations. We are going to use them for the National Sample Survey. We're going to use them to fight poverty.
Right. Very quickly, we'll take a look at the scoreboard and let's see what it's done to the fortunes of some of the quizzers. So Adit, Kartikeya, Nishant, RBR, and Adya. I think it definitely helped Adya get into the scoreboard. The next question, and double points for this one. A key reason why India was unable to acquire the American computer, the UNIVAC, as it was called, was because of Mahalanobis's leanings to communism, infrequent power supply in Calcutta causing short circuits, hot and humid Indian weather resulting in breakdowns, or lack of trained engineers to run the systems. Okay, I think this was sort of a very fascinating part in history. And Nikhil, what struck out for me when I was reading all of this was that this was a time, and it's a very important learning for us, that you could have very many different kinds of political leanings, ideologies, etc., but the focus was in getting the job done. And even if it meant that you had to look beyond your own ideology and look at somebody's prowess or their expertise in a particular area, you would ensure that you put those differences aside and focus on the task on hand. Is that your reading as well, Nikhil, or a little bit about?
Yes, I'd say that to some extent, there was this sort of broad governing ideology of the Congress Party, but the Congress Party at that time was a sort of umbrella party which had different ideologies within it. So there were some more right-wing leaning members of Congress, such as Purushottam Das Tandon, such as Sardar Patel, but there were also left-leaning members of the Congress Party that almost shaded into the Communist Party of India. Mahalanobis is interesting because while he did have associates who were communists, he wasn't necessarily a communist himself. He was more just an admirer of the Soviet Union for how quickly they had managed to industrialize their society, right? So he was not one for talking too much about politics. He would, in fact, often say that, politics is for politicians. He's a scientist and he's a physicist, and that the way that he was approaching planning is as a physicist. So he had this attitude that he was apolitical. Now, of course, we know that nobody is totally apolitical. Even the choice to be apolitical says something about where you stand in society. But the reason that the UNIVAC was very hard for India to get was because Americans saw the Indian Statistical Institute as a haven for communists. And of course, we know that Calcutta was the hotbed of a communist movement that would lead to Bengal being ruled by a state government of the CPM for many decades. And because of this association, the Americans refused to grant Mahalanobis and the ISI, and therefore India, the UNIVAC, because they felt that India would get the UNIVAC, and that this computer, despite what they're saying, they will use it for military reasons, or they will use it for purposes that further the spread of communism in India. And in the 1950s, at the high point of the Cold War, it was seen as only helping the enemy, right? That the ISI was seen as a beachhead for the Soviet Union and for perhaps the Soviet Union to start taking control of different parts of India.
Wow. This is really fascinating stuff. All right. So we'll look at the scoreboard and let's see what's happened there. It's Adit, Kartikeya, Adya, Parisha, and Nishant. Nishant's been having quite a volatile time today, but we'll get into the next question. India's first electronic computer was used, or rather was made using materials developed in IIT Kharagpur and IIT Kanpur, materials from scrap markets, materials imported from Britain and USSR because US wasn't helping us, or materials developed by Vikram Sarabhai's team at ISRO. Okay, so yes, it was indeed materials from scrap markets in Calcutta's Chandni Chowk market. Nikhil, when you sort of came up and stumbled on that, any surprises there? Or just, you know, we were always the kings of Jugaad, you can say that? Or what was the thought that was going through your mind?
I mean, yes, you have to remember that this is a time when computers are not very common anywhere in the world, right? In the early 1950s, there are, I mean, I write in the book that up to 1965, there were only 15 digital computers in India, period. Only 15 computers in India until the mid 1960s. So in the early 1950s, we're still talking about a time when computers are quite rare across the world. When India develops its first electronic computer in 1953, it is still the only digital computer in Asia outside of Japan. No other Asian country apart from Japan had any digital computer. And so given how cutting edge it was very expensive, and getting it from abroad for a country that was strapped for foreign exchange reserves was very difficult. And therefore they managed to make one, a very simple device using, you know, some materials that were from scrap markets of the Chandni Chowk market in Calcutta. Another story I tell is that when India did bring in one of its first computers from the UK, the HEC2M, they needed a very specific clearance between the sort of between certain parts of the machine. And one of the engineers, Samarendra Mitra, found that his cigarette paper did the job just fine. And so there was some amount of jugaad involved in this.
All right, so we'll take a look at the scoreboard. And we still have one question left, but it's now Adit, Adya, Parisha, Jitendra, and Kartikeya. We know a lot of upsets have happened on the Game of Facts right till the last question, so don't go anywhere. Please, very sincerely, put in that last answer, and then let's see what the podium throws out. So we'll get into the last question of this very fascinating quiz. And double points for this one. India Statistical Institute's experiment to understand productivity in cottage industries and female labor was called the Khadi and Village Industries Commission, Fab India, Kalyanashri, or the Coir Board of India. Clearly, it was all happening in Calcutta. And okay, so it was really between the Khadi and Village Industries Commission and Kalyanashri. This again, Nikhil, was a very fascinating chapter in your book. I don't think we should talk too much about this. Suffice to say that the Indian Statistical Institute clearly went above and beyond just the brief of, you know, running these statistics or providing surveys, etc., or running the surveys, but they really went into experiments to, you know, do some very radically different things that big organizations that have won the Nobel Prize today, like JPAL, etc., are doing. So what were your thoughts when you were thinking about just the gamut of work that the Indian Statistical Institute was doing?
Yeah, I wrote about Kalyanashri because I felt that this was an aspect of what was being experimented at the Indian Statistical Institute that has not been talked about much. We know to some extent that they were involved in these huge endeavors like the National Sample Survey. We know that Mal Nobis and the Indian Statistical Institute were involved in this very state-led, heavy industry kind of developmental model. But while there's the bigness of that development model, there's also a focus simultaneously on smallness, on what happens to the employment of women. What happens to not all of India, for example. India is still an agrarian country. At least 50% of India's workforce still works in agriculture or allied industries. At the time in the 1950s, it was much more. India was overwhelmingly an agrarian nation. And so, yes, we want to build factories, we want to industrialize, but that will mop up only a very small percentage of India's workforce. So what's the rest of Indians supposed to do? And how can Indians be most efficient at doing it? And so that's what Kalyanashri was, a method to, in a sense, almost under laboratory conditions, to study how village industries or cottage industries or informal sector industries could be made more efficient.
Super. So we'll look at the podium right now, and don't go anywhere. We just like to make some announcements, but maybe before we look at the podium, just very quickly, please remember next week's quiz is going to be run by the editors at India Spend. We're going to be talking about all things press freedom related, and it's all about the independence that media ought to have. So that's going to be a very interesting quiz. Also, the winners of this quiz are going to get Nikhil Menon's book. Now, he wasn't able or isn't able to sign it right now, but he's promised us that when he comes to India, I think somewhere in Nikhil, can you please quickly just give us your promise, and we're going to stalk you when you come down to India, because we love author signed copies.
Yes, please do. And I apologize for not being able to sign the copies. I should tell you that actually, in my defense, because of snags that we will not go into, I myself have not got my own copies. So your winners will actually get the copies of the book before I have held the copy in my own hand. So you should feel good about that. And I'm not in India, and unfortunately, so I'm not being able to sign the books, but I'm coming in early July to India. And so I would be more than happy to, if India Fact Quiz could send me the copies of the winners, I'm happy to sign them and send them back. Or if they happen to be in the city that I'm in, I'm happy to maybe at a bookstore sign the copy in person, whichever works best.
Super. So we're going to keep track of that. And very quickly, we're going to look at our top 3 winners this week. And here we have them. In the 3rd position, we have Jitendra. In the 2nd position, it's Karthikeya. And in the number 1 spot, we have Adit. Congratulations to all of you. And Nishant and Adya are our runner-ups. So don't forget to fill in your name and details in the Google form that is circulated at the end. Thank you, Nikhil, so much for this very, very interesting time. It was absolutely fascinating. We'd love to keep track of your movements when you're here in India. And if any of our quizzards want to meet up with you in whichever bookstore, whichever city you're going to be in, we'd love to do that. And before we leave, just a big shout out to Disha Naik from Penguin as well for facilitating this. And yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Nikhil.